So, all of you know the results of the 2016 presidential election. But what you may not have known is that Harambe got over 2 million votes nationwide. Now, unfortunately, he didn't win the election. But in the city of Cincinnati, he was elected honorary governor. Now, obviously, he isn't fit to hold the office in his current state, but the city has promised to dedicate a memorial in his name. And now we're going to cut to Edwin, who's reporting on some breaking news happening in our local area.
Hello, Nathan. We're here at Regis University right now. I'm getting word right now that Trevor Siemian, quarterback of the Denver Broncos, is in a high-speed chase right now with police behind him. He's expected to have a few pounds of cocaine in the trunk of his car, and he's passing by Regis University right now. You can hear the sirens right now, and the helicopters are going crazy.
Now, the stories you just heard have obviously been blown out of proportion. And there's a term for that. It's called yellow journalism.
Yellow journalism is an exaggerated, exploitative, and sensational style of newspaper, social media, and television reporting. It emerged at the end of the 19th century when rival newspapers' publishers competed for sales in the coverage of events leading up to and during the Spanish-American War in 1888.
Two journalists who used yellow journalism to great effect were Pulitzer and Hearst. These guys exaggerated events that they reported on in their newspaper, and they used sensationalism in order to make a profit. One event in particular that they sensationalized was the sinking of the USS Maine. They immediately blamed the Spanish for the accident, even though there was no evidence to support that claim, and yet the information that they reported on was so shocking that the U.S. eventually entered the war because of it.
Yellow journalism has come a long way, and it has evolved in today's culture, but it has the same principle. They want you. We live in a culture right now where everyone wants likes, everyone wants follows, and that's how social media works. People crave these things, and so does like big news sites on Facebook or Twitter. They want you to share their news stories. They want you to comment on them, to like them. So they create these titles that are completely out of proportion. They change their stories. Some of those stories are not even real at all, but they will take any rumor they can find to sell that story to you so you can share it and everyone can see it.
So, I guess that begs the question, why should you care about all this misinformation being spread? Well, for one thing, that misinformation can overshadow the real issues. For one example, there's politics. Yeah, good stuff. Yeah, candidates frequently use smear campaigns during election season in order to get votes. Instead of talking about their stance on issues and their solutions for said issues, they instead attack the character or the actions of the other candidate and try to paint them out as a completely terrible person who does not deserve any votes. For example, look at this last election. Clinton and Trump were constantly smearing each other throughout the debates and their campaign rallies. We didn't really get much information as to what they had planned to solve actual issues in our country. It was mainly just a game of, making the other person look bad and making yourself look much better.
But it can also work in different ways. For example, instead of creating shocking stories to get the people's attention, a lot of the times it can work for the opposite thing, which is distract the people from the real issues, to make them, to pacify them, to not get them to worry about real issues that are happening. One thing that happens in all over the world is that governments from anywhere in the world pay these news outlets, these news providers, to create shocking stories that distract the people from focusing on government scandals, for example.
All right, so now that we've laid out the problem, let's talk about what you can do to address that problem.
So the first step is to recognize when you see one of these titles. How can you recognize yellow journalism? Well, you can recognize it simply by looking at the headline. Is it exaggerated? Is it something that sounds absurd? Then it probably is.
So once you recognize that a story is an example of yellow journalism, the next step is not to support that story. So, for example, don't share the story on social media, don't share it with your friends, don't click on it, because a lot of the journalists who put out these stories, they're looking for clicks, at least in the context of social media. So you can help combat this by not giving them the attention that they want. And with regards to papers or tabloids, just simply don't buy them. If they're not making sales on these stories, then they won't have the incentive to run those stories.
So instead of buying the newspaper, magazines, or clicking those news stories, you can instead do your own research. There are also a few sites that are unbiased on these issues. We have, for example, politifact.com. We have therealnews.com. So you can use these news sites to get your do some fact checks on the news that you hear on TV, for example. Like we said before, most of that is exaggerated, and so you should do your own research.
As college students, we have the concept of critical thinking continually hammered into our heads. Well, this is an instance where it is important to demonstrate critical thinking skills when we evaluate the media and the stories that we're being presented with. It's important to critically think about the stories that we're being presented with because those stories inform our opinions, and our opinions then dictate how we vote, how we view the world and interact with others. So it's important that we get our information from as unbiased a source as possible, so that we don't, inadvertently discriminate against people who we perceive as different as us based off of misinformation that we've been presented.